Welcome to the 136th PACOR Zoom conference with a presentation and a conversation on today, Monday, March the 1st, if you're watching us live, or whenever you choose to watch us later on using our YouTube. I've had the pleasure of working with Ralph Smith. I hesitate to say because I don't want to mark his age, for a few decades. The most notable project in which he substantially assisted me was designing and running the energy workshop at the International Conference on the Changing Atmosphere, held held in Canada, in Toronto, in 1988. He's currently working with Corporate Knights, and as you can see on the screen, that's a very interesting media research firm. I subscribe to the Globe and Mail, and I get the benefit of receiving their quarterly magazine. So there's a good reason for subscribing to the Globe and Mail. So with that, Ralph, over to you, please.
Thank you, John. It's been my pleasure to have had such a long association with you, and I appreciate your words of introduction. Is my slideshow visible the way it should be?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm just going to give a little bit of context before zeroing in on my main focus today, which is the work that we've been doing at Corporate Knights on identifying the companies that are leading in the sustainability transition in terms of providing the goods and services that we need to make that transition. This first slide is, some of you may have seen it before. We owe it to Rockstrom at the Potsdam Institute, fellow that developed the modern version of the limits to growth with the global limits concept. And it creates a vision of a moment of the historical moment that we're at that suggests that we are about to start gathering momentum in a historic transformation, which will leave behind the way that we have seen ourselves in relation to the rest of nature and to each other, and replace it with a new understanding of where the human civilization and human economies fit within the larger system in which they are embedded. And at the heart of this transition, and one of the things that is pushing it forward, of course, is the climate crisis that the world faces. It's made us come face to face with the unsustainability of the framework, or the paradigm, if you like, that we have been using to live by for the last couple of hundred years at least. It does change from time to time. We didn't always have the view of ourselves that we have now. The further back you go, the more instances you will come across where our understanding of where we fit in the scheme of things went through comparable transformations to the one that we're now on the verge of, which we might call the ecological transformation, where we finally come to understand the importance of finding a balance between our activities and the ecological and thermodynamic rules that govern this place where we live. And a big part of this transition, as I've mentioned, is the energy transition. There's technological innovation, there's the environmental imperative, there's some very interesting market trends that I'm going to be talking about that have been moving the system gradually in this direction, but it's accelerating now, partly as a response to the climate emergency, and partly because of a growing realization of the economic and the geopolitical risks of the status quo. This transition is also driving the growth in these new technologies and materials and associated services that are largely going to define the economic history of the coming century. Companies with revenues and investments that align with sustainability are establishing their positions now, and I'm going to be going into that a little bit, and leading this transition. I think there's 6 themes. There's more than 6, but there's 6 that I like to think about when I'm, whoops, got ahead of myself. A couple of additional slides that show what we hopefully will be in for as we move forward. This first one actually is looking back historically, just to set the context of what's been happening in the growth of clean energy technologies in the last 20 years, basically. And there's a couple of interesting things about this chart. One, of course, is the hyper growth rates being exhibited by renewable energy and electrified transportation, the orange and the green bars in this chart. Another fascinating one is that these technologies actually accelerated during the pandemic. Their growth rates accelerated while the rest of the economy was faltering. In terms of where the leadership is on this, unquestionably, it's in the Asia Pacific region, followed by Western Europe countries, and trailing sort of in 3rd place in terms of these 3 regions that are leading the economic transition that goes along with the sustainability transition. North America comes in to that 3rd position. The United States, as you'll see in a moment, is still the largest in terms of absolute investment levels in the transition, but on a per capita or per dollar of GDP basis or other sort of intensity metrics, the action up until now, at least, has been largely in China and other Asian countries, and in Germany and other Western European countries. It's moving very quickly. What we're looking forward to, and this is from the International Energy Agency's report a couple of years ago already, where they looked at what would happen, what needs to happen if we make good on our commitment to deal with the climate crisis. We'll see the global spending on clean energy reaching $4 trillion, about 2.5 times the Canadian GDP. So this is pretty big. And in this next decade, there are some technologies that are leading the charge, if you want to put it that way, most notably the growth of wind and solar power and the associated electricity infrastructure of the new distributed and highly information-intensive electrical grid. The electrification of transport, of course, which is following close behind, but nearing its tipping point in terms of accelerating up the S-curve of adoption. And also what's going on with the way we look at buildings and the technologies that we bring to buildings and the potential for decarbonization in that sector as well, the so-called smart building phenomenon. Conventional biofuels are also there. There's some uncertainty about the long-term role of biomass as an energy component of the energy system. But in terms of the advanced biofuels and also hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, these tend to be regarded as possibilities, but not ones that will make very large contributions in the 2020s. There's quite a strong consensus that the technologies that are contributing to this transition do fall into these categories, and I'll say a little bit more about that. There was a very interesting paper presented by Lord Stern at Davos in January that I'm going to show you a slide from a little bit later that reinforces this point that the renewable electricity growth, which is phenomenal on a global scale, is the first of these groups of technologies to really turn the corner on the S-curve of adoption. But close behind it are the electric vehicle and smart building transitions. You can see some of the growth rates that will accompany this transition for specific technologies. The compound annual growth rate to 2030, way up in the double digits, incredibly high rates in a number of these. And yeah, this is a projection, but if you think back to that historical chart that I was showing you of the exponential growth that we're already being exhibited in a number of these areas, these are not out of the question that we are going to see hyper growth in a number of these sectors throughout the 2020s, and in particular, batteries, electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, the lithium market that goes along with that, as well as heat pumps, smart buildings, plant-based protein. So this brings me to the slide I started to talk about a moment ago. I break this into 6 themes. There's more, but these are the 6 that I've chosen just to say a little bit about, and that'll finish off my context, and then I'll jump into the way we're quantitatively analyzing this transition and the work that we're doing at Corporate Knights. The new grid, I've already sort of mentioned. Electricity is going to displace fossil fuel as the largest source of energy end use globally, probably in the lifetime of at least some of us on this call. Notwithstanding the demography of the Club of Rome, I think we will live to see that. It's happening very quickly, and this reflects the impact of the heat pump and the electric vehicle, technologies that we did not really envisage 10 years ago even, having a major role, allowing electricity to infiltrate the markets that it historically has not had much of a role in, that is the heat, low temperature heat in particular, and the transportation markets. Also, electrification and grid decarbonization are top priorities in climate change response strategies everywhere, as nations seek to reduce the role of combustion in meeting human energy needs. We're also seeing unprecedented cost reductions in the distributed renewable energy sources and also in storage and in the digital controls that go along with the new grid. And unprecedented in an awesome way. Some of you, no pun intended, may have seen the paper by Way and his colleagues out of Oxford last year that showed how the unit cost reductions in solar and wind are unlike anything that we've seen in the history of the energy sector. It looks a lot like Moore's law, frankly, although we know it's probably not in this case, but nevertheless, very, very dramatic drops in the unit costs of solar and wind, something that nothing, in spite of the fact that oil and gas technology did come down over the decades, coal came down over the decades, it did not exhibit a decline in cost, anything like the one that we're seeing with these renewable sources. And nuclear actually has been going up. So that's another driver. And finally, investments in the new grid are running well ahead of capital expenditures and other components of the transition. I've already made a reference to that. And we will see $15 trillion invested in the new grid in the 2020s, easily. The second theme, smart buildings. This is an interesting one, partly because Canada has some of the largest real estate portfolio holders in the world are headquartered here. So we have an opportunity here. There's been great advances in building technology that have redefined what constitutes a good building, an effective and productive building that's comfortable and safe and healthy with a healthy and productive indoor environment. And interest in these buildings only increased during the pandemic, as did the growth in the investment and the spending that we're seeing in that sector. Double digits throughout the 2020s for sure, probably reaching averaging $1.7 trillion US a year throughout this decade. The global share of highly efficient buildings with net zero emissions and smart control systems is going to grow from less than 1% to 25% by 2030. It's moving very, very quickly. The third theme, transportation transformed. This, of course, is primarily about the vehicle electrification, which is the cornerstone of the efficiency and decarbonization that will characterize the sustainability transition. The electric vehicle population is on a very steep growth curve, belying all of the forecasts and projections of governments and the industry itself year after year. It will reach $1 trillion by 2026. And the transition from combustion engines to electric motors is also transforming the supply chains in this sector, with the lithium-ion battery market expected to exceed $100 billion by 2030. Other drivers of disruption and opportunity in this sector, including the shifting settlement and mobility patterns, transport as a service business models, growing shares of 2- and 3-wheel vehicles, which are already dominant in many Asian countries, and a modernized public transit infrastructure. The fourth theme, circularity. In the sustainability transition, the take, make, waste model of production gives way to circular flows of materials in which products are designed for durability and repair to facilitate materials recycling and reuse at the product's end of life. The environmental footprint of reusing and or recycling is a fraction of the footprint of once through production and consumption, and the economics of materials reuse and recycling have been steadily improving as ore concentrations decline and the social and environmental costs of mining increase. The levels of recycled content are already quite high for some materials like aluminum, steel, and paper products, and the circular economy is attracting increasing policy support and business investment. It's a megatrend. Its economic potential is difficult and perhaps too big to measure. Interesting, in the ranking that Corporate Knights does for the last 20 years of the top 100 sustainability performance in publicly traded companies in the world, this year, for the first time, the #1 company was not a maker of windmills as it was last year, or some other sector where you might naturally expect a sustainability ranking to result in a high score. It went to Schneider Steel, an electric recycling steel operation that basically also runs on carbon-free electricity. A sign of the times, I think, as we see circularity taking an increasingly important place on the priority list for the sustainability transition. The fifth theme, the decarbonization of protein. Plant-based proteins are 80 to 99% less greenhouse gas intensive than their meat alternatives. Increasing their supply is going to be an essential component of sustainably feeding a world population that is now 8 billion and growing. The market for these plant-based food sources is growing exponentially and could make up 8% of the global protein market by 2030, with a value in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Canada, once again, already a major player in this area and positioned to continue to be, partly thanks to our proximity to the US market, but also due to the natural advantages that our ecosystems provide us with in terms of the production of plant-based protein for the world food market. My final theme, I call it renewing the land. In the sustainability transition, production practices that have impaired the long-term productivity and health of agricultural and forest ecosystems are replaced with regenerative farming and forest business models that put a premium on high value-added production. The combined application of high technology, holistic ecosystem management, advanced ecological science, this revitalizes land-based production and revives the prospects for both the companies and the communities that depend on agriculture and forest lands for their livelihoods. Again, an incredibly important theme in the Canadian context, where we know the future of agriculture and especially of forestry is going to look very different from what it has been, and actually looks fairly bright as we move away from cutting and burning and wasting to a more sustainable ecosystem-based management of these systems with much higher value-added products being developed, particularly in the forestry sector. So what we're doing now, if I could just shift to the discussion of the Corporate Knights work in this field. And I've been there just under 2 years now. And the project has been, first of all, let's develop a taxonomy of sustainable production. And by that, I mean a systematic definition, sector by sector, of what we at Corporate Knights are defining as either basically sustainable products and services. And then using the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the European Union taxonomy as reference points. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, because we're determined that our taxonomy be not only focused on climate change, but on the more general sustainability transition. You'll see in a moment some of the ways that we're trying to achieve that. And having established this taxonomy, we then have a team of people that have been systematically going in company by company. We've looked at all of the companies in the Morgan Stanley All Capital World Index, plus a number of other interesting lists of companies like the Transition Pathways Initiative and the Climate Bonds Initiative companies and the S&P 500. And for each of these companies, we seek out, and often by engaging with them directly, how much revenue are they making that aligns with our taxonomy? And with respect to their investments, how much of their capital expenditures, research and development, and acquisitions align with our taxonomy? The structure of the taxonomy looks like this. Busy slide, but just to give you a sense of the way we're approaching this, each column represents what we call a tier 1 of the taxonomy. And so we have buildings, energy, vehicles, primary production, so that's steel and cement and aluminum and so on. Green products, which covers most of the rest of manufacturing. Water, waste, and ecosystem restoration as a category unto itself. Telecom and IT, medicine and technology, and then of course the finance and insurance sector itself. And the final category, consulting and business services, is really just folds back over the previous 9 categories, so that companies that are in the business of providing business services and consulting services that support the other categories can participate in this initiative that we've undertaken to identify sustainable revenue and capital in these publicly traded companies. And then for each one of these tiers, we break it down into second order tiers. I'm not even going to attempt to summarize that, except to say the tier 1 definitions I just listed are each one is a tip of a fairly large iceberg of definitions. This next slide just zooms in on the buildings tier, where what we do is we define what we mean by a building. In this case, we're looking for 0 emissions. And then we have at the second tier level definitions of what we're looking for. And then we also have certifications that we accept as evidence of sustainable production. We have researched, I think, about 400 so-called eco certifications. And there's a couple of dozen, well, there's a few dozen of them that passed what we think is a fairly high standard we apply. They have to have independent third party. They have to have a transparent, credible method. And they, of course, have to align with they have to be repeated on a regular basis, and they have to align with our overall approach to the definition of sustainable production. We then, as I've already mentioned, take this taxonomy and go to work looking at these publicly traded companies. We cover the globe. We cover all industries. Right now, we've looked at about 2,800 publicly traded companies. We have data from 2019, 2020, and 2021, and the 2022 data is now just starting to come in. We pull this data from annual reports, from sustainability reports. We do quite a lot and an increasing amount of direct engagement with companies. Hundreds of companies engage directly with us through an online portal that we're operating. And we have found $10 trillion of sustainable revenue and about $1.3 trillion of sustainable investment. In other words, revenue and investment that aligns with our taxonomy. It's a big undertaking, it's audacious, but we're getting lots of interest, and we're just now, after working quite hard on this for the past year, starting to have results that are proving useful to investors and asset managers and so on in the field. who are under pressure from their clients, quite frankly, to green their portfolios and are hungry for the kind of guidance that this type of research can provide them with as to which companies and which sectors are leaders in the sustainability transition. And you can see in the bottom donut of this slide how the how the capital expenditures break down by our top tier taxonomy categories. And as I've already mentioned, renewable energy definitely is leading the group, but you can see, and these are billions of dollars, but you can see the vehicles and the buildings, water, waste and ecosystem restoration, and telecom and IT, all quite significant and growing quickly. You might wonder about telecom and IT. This is a subject of ongoing and vigorous discussion within the sustainability community, the extent to which companies that are in the business of providing telecommunications and information technologies ought to be considered contributing to the sustainability transition. It's a very interesting discussion. On the one hand, there's the position that the transition is largely about a shift from energy to information, and the information technology companies are absolutely foundational to the infrastructure for the sustainability transition, and therefore, to a very large extent, should have their revenues and investments counted as contributing to sustainability. And then the argument on the other side of the table is, yeah, but there's a lot of activity by IT companies, which you would be hard pressed to say is aligned with sustainable outcomes. So there are approaches being used to try and limit the contribution to what is reasonable to attribute to sustainability. One of the ones that we do is we discount, to the extent these IT companies are taking the money that they make out of the company and distributing it either to their executives or their shareholders, we deduct that. We want to see, so we focus the credit on those IT companies that are plowing their profits back into the development and growth of the underlying IT infrastructure that's so important to the transition. In tabular form, and I'll just run through a little bit more on what we've been finding. As I said, if you look at it in terms of company years as opposed to companies, we've looked at over 7,600 company years looking for sustainable revenue, and 6,500 company years with respect to investment. So these are those 2,800 companies, but we're looking at 2019, 20, and 2021 data. And you can see we find sustainable revenue and sustainable investment in about 38% and 46% respectively, to some extent. Greater amounts in some than others, obviously, depending on the industry. But as I mentioned earlier, so far, we've looked at $144 trillion of $143 trillion of revenue and identified 10.2 trillion in this slide, but it's up to 10.3 now. It goes up every day of sustainable revenue. On the investment side, we've looked at 15 trillion and identified 1.3 trillion that aligns with our taxonomy. So 7% of revenue, 9% of investment so far. That needs to get all the way up to 100 ideally, but it's not a small number that we've identified. And as I mentioned earlier, it's growing year by year. Where we're finding it, I've said a little bit about this. This is the revenue broken down by industry categories. You can see the telecom phenomenon in the front that I was referring to, but power generation and other industries lining up behind them. Interestingly, when you look at where the revenue is in terms of our taxonomy tier, you can see, again, setting aside the telecom phenomenon and the IT phenomenon, renewable energy, green products, vehicles, the finance sector, all with significant revenue that aligns with our taxonomy. These are billions, so here we see the renewable energy industry at about a little over $2 trillion in revenue over this 3-year period. you can break, because of the tiered structure of the taxonomy, you can break it down further. And it's interesting when we look at where the revenue in renewable energy is coming from, for example. Well, of course, you would expect it to be in power generation, and that is far and away the leading sector, and power transmission and distribution, because we do give credit to T&D companies that are moving renewable electricity. But the supply chain is also showing up in larger and larger numbers the more we dig. The machinery manufacturing industry, they make the wind turbines. The semiconductor and electronic components industry, they make the solar cell components, and so on. The refining, petrochemicals, and basic organics industry is showing up here because of the very significant efforts that one or two oil companies at least have made to make the transition to away from oil and gas. I'm thinking of Neste in particular in Europe. Of course, the battery manufacturing company and the electric equipment manufacturing sector showing up. So you can see the way that the sustainability transition, which has these rock stars like electric vehicles and heat pumps and smart buildings and renewable electricity, is pervading the economy as more and more companies are gaining more and more of their revenue from providing the supply chains to those leading indicators of the transition. These charts with the red bars are focused on investment, as opposed to the earlier ones I was just showing, which are looking at revenue. And here again, I'm going to go quickly, just in the interest of time, to the breakdown that shows up by our taxonomy tier. And here you can see renewable energy, again, far and away leading the charge in terms of attracting investment. But vehicles, water, buildings, primary production, green products, all in the tens of billions of dollars at this point and growing. This is more about how we can look at where the supply chain growth is taking place. I won't dwell on that. I believe there'll be a copy of this entire deck, including some slides that I'm only reading and are not being included in the visual today, that will be shared with everybody. Interesting, when we look at the sustainable investment, most of it is capital expenditure, but there's significant contributions from R&D and acquisitions. I don't know if I show how this, oh good, I do. This is the kind of fascinating thing that we're finding. If you look at the way that capital investment is breaking down in the renewable energy industry, it's mostly capital expenditure and acquisitions. The R&D is still there, but it's largely turned the corner now, and it's in its steep part of its adaptation curve, the S curve. Whereas if you look on the right-hand side at the electric vehicle phenomenon, you can see that a significantly larger portion of their capital investments is still in the R&D column, as the products are continuing to undergo an intensive period of development and refinement. It's going to be only a very short amount of time before the emission-free vehicles pie will look a lot more like the renewable energy pie looks today, as the R&D gives way to increasing levels of capital expenditures on new factories and associated acquisitions. So you can see what we're trying to do here is give capital, give investors who are our target clients for this, insights that will help them see where the puck is headed, to use that Wayne Gretzky cliche that gets overused so much, but there it is. And if you see a significant level of R&D today, chances are 1 or 2 years from now, that's going to be a significant source of sustainable revenue. And finally, when we're finished, even though we don't, and I'm getting very near the end for those of you who are hoping, even though we don't consider financial performance at all in doing this work, everything is strictly how much of your revenue and how much of your investment aligns with our sustainability taxonomy. When we're finished, we do have all of these numbers analyzed by a third party, Solactive, a German company that specializes in this kind of thing. And interestingly, what we find is that the Corporate Knights Global 100, which is an index that is based on this work, is outperforming the MS-ACWI, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, the ACWI ESG Index, consistently over the last 20 years, but especially since 2019, 2020, when we introduced these sustainable investment and sustainable revenue metrics. Prior to that, it was a fairly traditional ESG method that was being used, where we were looking at the environmental, social, and governance performance of the operations of companies, which is interesting. But the big story is, what are the impacts that companies are having as a result of what it is that they make? And that's where the sustainable economy intelligence really comes into play. We're much more focused now, not on whether the company runs a clean shop or not, but on whether what it's making is making a material contribution to the sustainability transition. And I said earlier that I wanted to show you a slide that Nicholas Stern and colleagues presented at Davos in January. Sorry about the mess at the top. But what this really shows, and it looks like I haven't done a very good job of pasting it in here, but each row, if you want to put it that way, represents a segment of the sustainability transition. And as the color goes from red to green, it's moving up the S-curve. And the little blue targets represent this group's assessment of where the market tipping point really takes place, and the steep part of the curve gets underway in earnest. And so while this looks like a snapshot, what I see is a wave. It's a wave that's frozen in time, but you can see that just around the corner, we will see the light vehicle road transport, the fugitive emission, the smart building phenomenon, all turning the corner on the S-curve in the next year, actually this year or next year. It's happening as we speak.
I'm sorry.
I didn't want to.
It's in the box and in that thing there. Sorry.
Sorry, somebody needs to be on mute, I think. That basically gives you an overview of what we're doing. I find it quite encouraging. There's a lot of capital available in the world that is trying to figure out where to go. Canada alone, if you just look at our largest banks and our pension funds, it's $10 trillion of capital available to be applied to what needs to be done. And what needs to be done is this transition. We have to do this. The integrity of our civilization depends on it. And I think the good news out of all of this is that there's increasing amounts of evidence that some of the largest, and all of the companies in our database, by the way, almost all of them, have at least $1 billion of revenue. So these are big organizations, some of them really big. And they are turning this corner and are increasingly focused on what is starting to be clear to those who look to the future is going to be the business opportunity of the next century, not unlike the way fossil fuels and the automobile were the opportunities of the 20th century. And for those who were clever enough to see that coming in 1910 or 1920, built empires and economic wealth on the basis of those growth areas. So too, one can now begin to see the shape of what's coming in terms of growth in those 6 theme-based areas that I referred to at the beginning, near the beginning of my talk. And that I think it gives me some hope. I realize this is not necessarily the anti-growth transition to let's just worry about being happy and not being well off kind of approach that I have a lot of sympathy for, but we're just trying to, this work that I've been doing this last couple of years has really been trying to provide capital with the information and insights that it needs to accelerate the sustainability transition. The implicit assumption being that we're probably going to have to wait until after the transition to find an alternative to capitalism. So we got to work with the system we've got. So that basically enough, hopefully, to stimulate some conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Would you like to turn your slide off now? Ralph, I and I think many people have been thoroughly disappointed by the action, or rather the lack of action, of our governments. What was it that got some corporations to get ahead like this? Did government policies have anything to do with it, or was it a question of ethics or values?
I think it was, first of all, I would say that that's a very sort of standard take on one of the reasons the transition is taking so long to develop momentum, that governments have not done what they need to do. And I don't really disagree with that. But I would add that I've been particularly disappointed in the private sector, which obviously, given the magnitude of the job that needs doing and the range of skills that are going to have to be applied, is going to have to play a big role in making this transition come about. And one of the things I've been enjoying about this work I've been doing the last couple of years is I'm getting some insight into what is basically the answer to the second part of your question, which is that some of it is just greed. You know, greed drives a lot of corporate decision making. And it turns out, as one of my last slides showed, my second last slide, that investing in these things is actually good business now. Maybe that wasn't always the case, but there's no doubt now that the big growth areas are in the sustainability transition. We see the insurance industry pulling right out of fossil fuels, as most of you probably know, for example. So people can see which way the wind is blowing. But secondly, particularly in some of these very large corporate organizations, there are from time to time visionaries and visionaries in the CEO position in particular that can make a huge difference in the contribution that their organization is making to this transition. And you know, that's part of the driver as well. But no, you don't tend to see government leading, sometimes at the local level, but so far I think national governments have really not been the reason that we're, you know, that's driving this corporate activity so much. If anything, I think we may be getting to the point where you're going to see increasing lobbying from the business sector for government to catch up, to get the regulatory frameworks changed in a way that will clear the way for what needs to be done, because a lot of our regulatory frameworks are actual impediments to the levels of investment and the accelerated rate of change that are going to be required. I'm thinking of the retrofit challenge in particular, but also the electricity sector. Completely inappropriate regulatory framework for what needs to happen next. But I would add also that if we are going to do this on a scale that is effectively responding to climate change, you know, and we say it's an emergency, I mean, you compare our response to COVID with our response to climate change, they're not even in the same order of magnitude. We spent $250 billion 2 years in a row responding to COVID. That's what an emergency response looks like. An effective response to climate change over the next 10 years would probably require half of that per year. So in case of Canada, we need to invest about $1 trillion over the next 10 years. And this is, you know, don't forget, we're well over a $2 trillion a year economy. So this is not out of the realms of feasibility. And then probably another $1 trillion after that. The Royal Bank says it's a $2 trillion transition. We came up with $130 billion a year for the next 10 years in the Corporate Knights outlook. The government of Canada's last budget said it looks like about $120 billion a year. So it's a pretty big deal. But as a percentage of our GDP, it's manageable. There are some aspects of this, though, and particularly the transition in the building sector, where it would be very helpful and perhaps necessary to have the public investor taking a much more active role. You know, public investment is a pretty low contribution to capital investment in this country compared to where it has been from time to time historically. I think it got up over 50% during World War II. I'm not suggesting that we need to go there. In fact, we don't. We don't even have to come up to half the level that we mounted for COVID. But if we're going to make this transition at a pace which is aligned with the need to respond effectively to climate change, the public investor is going to have to be an active participant. And we need to see more of that, because they bring the long-term, patient, sovereign money to the table.
Thank you. Well, David Pollock is taking the floor. Please, David. I'd like to invite Phil Riley to turn on his microphone and video while David is speaking, if he's still there. He asked the first question. David, are you ready to go, please?
Yes, I was just waiting. Hi there. Just waiting to get my video turned on by Art. Thanks, Art. Hi, Ralph. Good to see you, even remotely.
Hi.
I guess my assessment is that we're well beyond the 1.5 targets in terms of temperature change, and perhaps headed for 4, and maybe it can be pulled back somewhat less than that. But my specific question is, when I look at the policy scene in Canada, I was just interested in your thoughts on this. It seems to me that there's been a huge amount of work by the oil and gas companies to convince policymakers that carbon capture and storage is really a very significant transition investment to make, and one that will have some major positive effects. And any of the study or analysis I've been able to do on this, some on my own and some from other people, I'm very skeptical about both the pace, the efficiency, the usefulness of this as a major policy instrument to help us with a transition away from fossil fuels. And I'm wondering, because you're so steeped in the field, what your perceptions and reflections are. Am I wrong to be so pessimistic about carbon capture and storage? Thanks.
Yeah, for my part, I'm with you on that. We don't give it much. I mean, we have a space for it in our taxonomy, but a company would actually have to show revenue for anything to show up there. And the Canadian Climate Institute, I think, also said if this option has a role to play, it's not going to be in the 2020s. And if we don't make progress in the 2020s, one could argue that we're in a whole different phase in the 2030s, because unless we can bend this curve in the next, by 2030, that's typically the reference year that's used, then, as you pointed out at the beginning of your question, the commitment to climate destabilization will have proceeded to a point where the cost of coping with it will be much greater than the cost of mitigating, and more of our effort will just have to go into coping with the fires and the floods and the loss of coastal land and so on, and the disease vectors and the heat waves and the public health implications and all the rest of it. So we have to make this work in the 2020s with the technologies that are ready and are just waiting for the business strategies and the public policies that can accelerate them. And carbon capture and storage is definitely not on that short list. Another problem, I was very influenced about 20 years ago by a scenario analysis that was done in the UK that was looking out at the potential for a low carbon future. And they had a carbon capture and storage component in their scenarios, but only in the medium term, because they pointed out that the residual carbon emissions from the carbon capture and storage technology are themselves problematic. Yeah. So it just seems like a future technology whose time may have passed.
Be nice if the government got that message too, Ralph. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I don't know how to respond to that. There's a lot of, this is a tough country. One of the things I've noticed in the last couple of years where I've been looking at the international data a lot is just how far behind North America and Canada in particular are in this transition. And that's very concerning. Never mind what happens to our oil and gas sector and whether it finds a way to hobble along for another decade or two. If we don't find ourselves with a significant piece of these 6 thematic areas that I talked about, then we won't remain a first-tier economy in the 21st century. And we got there in the 20th century because we had a piece of the fossil fuel market. We had a piece of the automobile market. Going into the 21st century, we've got to be there in the new electricity system. Now, maybe we won't make solar panels and windmills in Ontario, but we know about the systems, we know about the controls, we know how to make it work as a system. In the electric vehicle sector, maybe we won't be a powerhouse in electric cars, but we need to be making, we're very well positioned for the battery cycle. We've got all the ingredients, we have the minerals, we have the know-how. As I mentioned, plant-based protein is another area. So all of which is to say that notwithstanding what is probably a political reality, that old paradigm industries are going to continue to get, just because of their political power in this country, are going to continue to get irrational support from the government. At the same time, we've got to be encouraging everything we can, as much as possible, what are clearly going to be the dominant industries in the emerging economy. Carbon capture and storage is it's an old paradigm idea, you know, it's a sweeping it under the rug concept. It's anti-ecological in some fundamental way, in my view. There could be a long-term role in point locations in places like very large industrial establishments like steel mills or cement plants. I could see how the logic might work out there, but in terms of trying to decarbonize the widespread distribution of fossil fuels, I think that's a mug's game.
Thanks very much, Ralph. I agree with you.
Shall I continue here?
Yes, go ahead, John.
Pardon, I turned my sound off not to mess things up, and then I mess it up another way. I'd like to just to remind any participant who would like to make a point or ask a question to add your question to the chat list. John Meyer, following Phil Riley, you'll be up, and would you like to turn on your mic and video while Phil is speaking, please? Over to you, Phil.
Okay, so Ralph, it's nice to see you again. I remember you when you were a 2-person office in Ottawa. And
Oh, yeah.
and my comment is basically one of the role of communications in what you're doing. So before asking that question, I'd like to know how many employees you have in Corporate Knights, and what role your cooperation with other cooperative organizations play in your analyses. And when I take a look at Corporate Knights website, I see the magazine and other things that are being sent out. What importance do you put on communications in terms of getting your information out?
Well, and Corporate Knights was a magazine originally. So it's a communications company before it was a research company. It was founded by Toby Heaps, who's an investigative reporter by vocation. And so in that sense, communication is central to the DNA of the organization. What has happened in the last couple of years is that in the course of doing the research necessary to support the magazine, we've developed knowledge and insight, which is not always necessarily going to make the most compelling magazine article, but there's a market for it, and there's a need for it to be communicated and distributed to the people who have the ability to affect investment decisions in particular. We at Davos actually launched an ETF along with Mackenzie Investments, who will be marketing it, I think starting in earnest next month, that is based on our work. So that's another way that we're trying to get the results of the work we're doing out there and communicated and activated in a way that hopefully will make a difference. But I would say communication is central to Corporate Knights. We also do a lot of what we call impact projects, which is euphemism for we're not going to make any money, but it's got to be done. So I spent an hour on the phone a couple of days ago with the Auditor General of Canada's office, advising them on how to go about taking a look at Canadian policy for greening the economy. And we did a study last year on for Canadian businesses on how to protect themselves against the use of forced labor in the Uyghur northeast region of China, northwest region of China. So I'm straying a bit from your question, but communication is absolutely central to this transition. We're doing a tiny, tiny little bit at Corporate Knights, but this is a paradigm shift, right? So education has to be at the heart of it. I spent an hour on the phone with a bunch of people from the Deloitte Montreal office this morning, talking about how we have to change our way of thinking about buildings in order to change the way we do things. First, we have to start looking at things differently, and then the solutions will start suggesting themselves. And the way you change the way of looking at things is through education. We just have to keep hammering away at it. I talk to teachers and students any chance I get, for example, and I'd encourage all of you to do the same. Because we're talking about changing the way that we look at ourselves, and we can do it. We've done it before.
So a secondary question would be, you know KCOR, you've been a presenter a few times before. You apparently value the output that we have. Is there something that you could recommend to us that would allow us to have a greater outreach than just the Zoom meetings that we are very successful at?
Oh, gosh. First of all, I would not underestimate the ripples that go out from these Zoom sessions. It's a great initiative. I would have to think a bit about what else. I haven't thought about that question. The general answer is that you should do what you're best at and take advantage of your assets and attributes. And as an organization, I think that the credibility and stature of the Club of Rome is definitely an asset that could be applied to this. It brings credibility to points of view that you would bring forward. It's a very impressive network in Canada of people who are connected. So making use of that network in creative ways to try and do the kind of communication and education that needs doing would definitely be a priority. I think the work that KCOR has been doing, developing and lobbying for climate change policy is the kind of, that should be supported and continued. I'd be happy to put more thought into your question. You put me on the spot a little bit. I'm fairly new to KCOR, actually, in spite of the fact I've been a presenter a few times. I'm not really, I only have a sense of the demography and the experience of the membership, but I guess I would want to take a look at that to give a more thoughtful answer to your question.
I'm looking forward to the cooperation.
I mean, look at the experience in this group. You guys should be able to answer that question for yourselves. This is an incredibly influential group of people, privileged and influential. So do what privileged and influential people have always done and make yourselves heard and make yourselves
Very good.
impactful.
Right on. Hey, thanks, Ralph, for that. What I should let you know, Phil, is that Ralph is actually a member of KCOR. So you're talking to an immediate colleague. Ted Manning, would you turn your mic and video on while John Meyer is making his point or asking his question? John Meyer, over to you. He's disappeared. Oh, okay. Ted, if you're ready to go, please make your point or ask your question, and I'll come back to John Meyer.
Sure, no, happy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Ralph, it's been a long time. We worked at various times in the past where projects intersected at some point in the past. I come from a totally other perspective, which is now the service sector. I've been working for 25 years now with the UN World Tourism Organization and with various kinds of service things. And it strikes me that does this approach jive with what we're trying to do in the tourism, in the service sector? Tourism right now is the largest sector of the economy globally, and it actually has brought itself back to about the same level it was in 2019. But it is very, very vulnerable, and it doesn't generally produce anything other than experiences. So right now, we're working on it to make it really sensitive to adaptation strategies, to moving strategies, definitely making use of better technologies. But I'm wondering, and there is an initiative going on in the UN and with the Global Sustainable Tourism Council that sounds a lot like what you guys are doing, working with the biggest companies and trying to get them to figure out how to do it right. So my question is, have you been doing anything relative to the tourism sector or the service sector? And if not, is it compatible with what you are doing in other sectors and perhaps could feed off each other?
Well, we do cover off service sector activity and what we do, but I only have a peripheral awareness of some of the initiatives that are going on to green tourism. I got to say that on a personal note, I haven't been anywhere in the last 3 years, except in and out of Toronto on the train. And my brother spends one of my brother's winters in Florida and invited me to join him for a week this winter. So my wife and I went down, and it was great to have a visit, but I mean, it was awful. It was just a whole lot of greenhouse gas emissions getting there and back. And I don't know, maybe that's just Florida, but
it is the extreme.
It is the extreme. But yeah, I've been thinking about this because we all, I think most people like to travel, but it's a pretty GHG intensive activity, and I don't know aviation being one of the more difficult sectors to decarbonize. It's a tough one.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering whether any of the huge hotel chains like Hilton, who has 3,500 hotels globally, was the sort of large company that you might be dealing with. There are several others like that, or something like Carnival that owns 1/2 of the ships on the planet.
Yeah, we do include both cruise lines and hotels in we cover about 65 separate industrial categories and economic categories. And when it comes to hotels, we're looking for them to be operating zero emission buildings. We won't give credit, sustainable revenue and sustainable investment credit to any company that happens to be in a net zero building, but we will if it's a hotel.
Okay.
Because the building is such a central part of their business. And some chains are doing much better than others, as I think we all are aware if we've traveled around a bit in making that transition. But the big contribution that they can make is to get their buildings off fossil fuel and to work with the communities in which they are situated to minimize the transportation footprint of their guests and that kind of thing. Another significant one. But yeah, and as far as the service sector in general goes, yeah, we're there. You know, the service sector probably epitomizes a sector whose emissions are not themselves that important in the scheme of things, but whose impact on emissions can be quite important. And that's a really interesting distinction.
Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Following Dave Doherty, who's next up, would I ask Peter Bulkowski to put on his microphone and video if he's doing that. Over to you, David.
Great, thank you. Very interesting talk, Ralph. Thank you. I looked up global GDP at one point when you were talking about how much of the economy that's covered by all these companies you reviewed is sustainable. You said around $1 trillion, a bit more. Global GDP is about 100 trillion, a little more than that, 104. So we're talking less than 1%. And I was wondering, surely you have not examined the entire global economy. I understand that. But it would seem that we have a rather small proportion of global business that is sustainable on the basis that you defined. And I'm wondering how fast this is shifting, and specifically, will we have the majority of this sustainable by 2040, 2050, or some later date?
First of all, you can't compare the 100 to the 1. The 100 trillion is the output of the global economy. The $1 trillion was the investment level of the investments that are being made by these 2,800 publicly traded companies that we're following. So that's apples and oranges. But okay, if anything, the 10 trillion of sustainable revenue would be closer to a comparator to the 100 trillion. But even there, revenue is more like output as opposed to value added. And the 100 trillion is a GDP, so that's value added. So I think we're probably somewhere around 5-6%. If you could do the exercise, that's what you would come out with.
So how fast?
Whether we're going to get there in time, I don't know. What does in time even mean? I mean, I don't even know how to go. And I've done a lot of scenario analysis and futures analysis, and I still throw up my hands at a question like, will we get there in time? I do not know, because everything we do changes the outlook for getting there on time. This isn't like predicting which way a mechanical system is going to behave given an input shock. This is a big complex system, and we're part of it. So it depends is the answer. We could, though. I mean, that's the encouraging thing. We have the technological know-how. I think we might be smart enough, maybe not, to make this happen. It's going to get pretty difficult as time goes on if we don't accelerate, because the cost of climate change itself is going to start to mount to a point where it will start to crowd out investment in the solutions, if it's not already. So this is the human challenge. Can we do this? Are we smart enough to make the right choices to get there?
That's a very good way to put it. Your comments reminded me of something that I ran into circa 30 years ago with respect to predictions about how much we would be emitting, and the real problem, and how much climate change would result. And the real problem wasn't in trying to calculate how much GHG would cause temperature changes and ocean acidification. The real problem was trying to figure out how much GHG we're going to put in the atmosphere. And they had no way of predicting it.
Yeah. Well, we thought when the pandemic hit, it was an opportunity, that it was a bit of a wake-up call to the global economy, and that we would have an opportunity, if we could seize it, to come out of that with a round of greener, more sustainable investments. It doesn't look like that happened. I think when the IEA numbers come out tomorrow, it will confirm what some of us have already seen telegraphed in early numbers, which is that in 2022, greenhouse gas emissions pretty well got back to where they were in 2019. So we're back. And the gap between what we need to do and what we are doing is still quite large.
Well, I will try to locate that tomorrow and see if I can get it into our website in breaking news.
Thank you. John Legg, will you kindly turn on your microphone and video while Peter Bulkowski takes the floor? Peter, over to you to make your intervention.
Thank you, John. Ralph, you're doing some interesting work. How are you having an impact? What impact are you having within Putin's Russia, Communist China, India, Iran? These are the countries with the largest populations, with the largest growing energy consumption, with the largest, two out of those four have the largest growing populations. How are you having an impact there? If not, are you not doing what really amounts to the penny wise, pound foolish game?
I was ready to answer until your metaphor at the end. Can you elaborate on the penny wise, pound foolish? How what I'm doing is characterized that way?
If our consumption and our fossil fuel emissions are going to be dominated by Russian wars, Chinese expansion in coal plants, Iranian expansion, Indian expansion of coal plants and manufacture, as they try to push their living standards up from fairly low levels, our emissions are becoming a smaller and smaller fraction of the world output, and therefore reducing what is already a reducing fraction can have relatively little impact on the total, is I guess my
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, the countries that you mentioned, only the United States has a larger level of investment in sustainable technologies than does China. And that gap gets a little narrower every year. So the Chinese very early on, as many developing countries now have realized, have understood that the path to development and to pulling themselves out of poverty is through investment in these sustainable technologies and not in the status quo. They can't flip a switch and get out of that trap that they're in overnight, but the leadership and the direction, and this is also true in India, I would argue, where we're seeing very, very strong initiatives to decarbonize, is quite strong. And as far as whether we or I am personally having any impact in those countries, I'm sure I'm not, let alone Russia. However, those countries are definitely part of the transition that's going on. And if it continues, if the investment levels that we're seeing continue the way they have been growing, it suggests that the world economy will be dominated by China and other Asian countries over the coming decades. As for Russia, I think that they're in big trouble. I don't think they're having much of an impact on setting Ukraine war aside for a moment. The Russian economy is, as far as we can tell, is way, way behind the 8 ball in terms of making the transition to sustainable technologies. It's one more reason to worry about the future viability of the Russian state, in my view, is the extent to which they're running on empty in terms of the direction that their economy is going on. The Ukraine war, in a perverse way, has actually stimulated investment in the alternatives. The Europeans doubled down on efficiency. They doubled down on the switch off of fossil fuels in response to the threat of Russian curtailment of gas supplies. And we will look back And already you see commentators looking back on the Ukraine intervention as a bit of a watershed moment when European countries woke up to the fact that they were too dependent on the Russian gas. And all of the actions that, not all of the actions, but many of the actions that they've taken in response to that are perfectly aligned with the sustainability transition. They've gotten through this winter without the crisis that was predicted last summer because of demands. Yeah, it's a little warmer than it could have been, admittedly, in Europe this winter. But in addition, they've managed to reduce their demand. I think the total is 25%. So in a perverse way, I would argue that the Russian-Ukraine invasion has helped accelerate. I pointed out earlier that these technologies grew faster than other technologies throughout the pandemic period. So I think that some of the stress points you're talking about in the world actually lead to stimulation of growth in these sustainable transitions. I would also like to know what you think the alternative is. I mean, all one can do is try to put forward the best that one can in terms of what your skills are and what you know about. So this is what I'm doing. If you would like to advise me on what I could be doing that would be more effective, I would like to hear it, and I'll take your advice. What would that be?
I don't have advice for you, sir. As I think everyone in this group knows, I'm an old retiree from the oil sands, over 40 years there. I do not see the world demand and consumption of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas dropping radically in the type of time frame that we keep hearing of the next 7 years. And what I see of a forced drop in that is a dramatic enhancement of poverty. And that terrifies me. I don't have an easy answer. I would like to see improved storage capacity, economic storage capacity for electricity. And we are nowhere close to that except in small circumstances. Without that, the solar and wind are problematic. The storage remain. We have water storage, pump storage. We have some battery storage, but the amounts are relatively minuscule and very difficult to scale up economically. And it works fine for people like myself, who has a pension after working for 45 years in a reasonable paying job, and for most of the people in KCOR. But for millions and millions of Canadians, as well as people elsewhere, that is not true. We have a situation now where people are struggling to pay for groceries, let alone buying houses of the younger generation. So if we from my perspective, we need much improved alternative technologies, which I do not see us as being there in terms of scalable.
Okay, well, I mean, we can have a talk about poverty, but if you want to start with the continent on which that problem is most severe, that's going to be Africa. We could start by reviewing the record of the fossil fuel industry and helping that continent pull itself up by the bootstraps. And I don't think one would come away very impressed. We can also take a look at what the real prospects are on the ground for developing access to electricity in the African nations that would help pull them out of the poverty that you are so appalled by. And I think you would find that the emergence of these new electricity technologies have opened up a possibility for access to electricity in Africa that will develop in quite a different way than it did in the Western economies, without the need for the bulk transmission lines, at least initially, and with the possibilities of microgrids powered by solar and wind and hydropower, right down to the village level in some of those African countries, that will allow them to electrify at least the most essential of their devices and appliances and lights that are necessary to make that transition. So I think that if you look at the case of Africa, which is the best laboratory for addressing the central problem that you're saying we need to look at, which is poverty, I'm not sure that you would come up with a fossil fuel-based strategy that would be more effective than one which is based on a sustainable, ecologically sustainable building up of the energy system in Africa with these new technologies.
I would,
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much,
Yeah.
Ralph, for that conversation. Raymond Leray, will you turn your mic and video on while Ralph is responding to John Legg's nice, concise question, I hope. John, you're on.
Thank you, John. And thank you very much, Ralph, for that stimulating talk. My own background is in the Foreign Service for 31 years, and but before that I got a degree in civil engineering at McGill. But I will say, on the economics side, I find that I'm way behind. And so my question has to do with understanding your list, which I'm trying still to see the future of. So the first question is, how do you see your list evolving? I think it will be a list that can be boasted about by companies that are that appear on the list and show well on the list. Now, from those very small comments, is that roughly correct? Because I see this as a very useful tool for the future, and if one can actually encourage better performance in greenhouse gases on the part of companies, then so much the better. Because right now, we, as you said in other comments, we really do need to move it. Otherwise, we're going to be, well, way behind, and so on. Anyway, enough. John, that was the shortest I could make.
Brilliant. Ralph?
Maybe the consequence of the conciseness is I'm not quite sure.
What the question?
The list you're referring to is the taxonomy?
Yes.
Yeah, it's very much a living document, if that's what you were getting at.
Yes.
And the central problem that one faces, of course, is that sustainability only really applies to the whole system. There's no such thing as a sustainable technology. The best that, even a solar panel is not sustainable. And so the best that one can hope for in developing a taxonomy like this, I think, is to figure out what are the attributes of technology that are aligned with a sustainable system. And so that would be things, does it run on renewable energy? Does it produce waste? Does it produce toxics? Is it, what's the risk profile? What's the geopolitical risk profile, like that kind of thing. And so those are the kinds of things that we try to bring to bear. And then we have all kinds of interesting back and forth with the companies themselves over the definitions. And we update the taxonomy a couple of times a year as these changes accumulate. And our understanding of sustainability is changing all the time as well. So it will never be finished. All we can do is say at this moment in the transition, this is what we think we should be aspiring to in terms of the way we do our buildings and the way we build our transportation infrastructure and our energy infrastructure and the way we make our clothing and the way we produce our food, and then just keep trying to make it less imperfect over time.
Well, I find your answer very exciting, especially to see how it will evolve.
There's also another challenge that we face all the time in this work is, take vehicles, for example. We set for light vehicles, we say, well, to be counted in our taxonomy, you have to have a zero emission vehicle. 3 or 4 years ago, we included hybrid vehicles in our definition. And then we took it out. And then we put it back in again because we were getting pushback from the European in particular that plug-in hybrids at least ought to be considered. So that's the kind of trade-off that goes on. If you defined the taxonomy in pure terms, it would be in many instances unattainable. There's no point, for example, in the steel industry in setting the goal of zero, at least there wasn't any point. Maybe that's changing as we speak, in setting the goal of zero emission steel as how you get into our taxonomy. We wouldn't have any steel companies in our system if we did that.
Right.
Same goes for cement. So instead, what we try to do is look at the best available technology approach and set that as our standard. And naturally, that's also changing over time. So yeah, it's a continuing, evolving set of definitions, and it's a long way from perfect. A long, long way from perfect.
Well, you're really in the midst of it. That's you anyway. I can see how busy you must be. Yeah.
Thank you, John. I'd like to squeeze in 3 more speakers in the 8 minutes that we have left for this recorded part. While Ralph is responding to Raymond Lurie, Lynn Oliphant, will you please turn on your microphone and video? Over to you, Raymond.
Hi, thanks, John. Ralph, I'd like to congratulate you and the fantastic work you guys are doing at Corporate Knights. I've been following it, and I love the work you're doing. One comment I have, or question I have, is on the overall cost. So if I look at some of the projects I've seen being developed over the last little while, so the eBus project in Ottawa in particular, where some of the investments that would have been made anyways in buying diesel buses is included in the cost of doing electric buses, and actually in that case, the case of the city of Ottawa, the cost, in my opinion, is overinflated. But anyways, and we already, if you look at the energy industry worldwide, it already spends somewhere around $600 billion a year, I believe it is, on capital investments, right? So how much of this money is truly additional money, and also how much of this money would be offset by the savings we would get by, for example, again, to the eBus project, we're expecting that OC Transport will save about $50 million a year in operational costs, which would largely pay for the incremental investment anyways, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the level of the individual decision, the incremental life cycle cost is really the one that one would want to focus on. So the overall lifetime cost of owning an electric bus versus the overall lifetime cost of owning a diesel bus, that would be the comparison. In the work that we're doing, however, if we look at a bus company and it's got $100 million of revenue selling electric buses, we count that as $100 million. We don't count it, in an incremental way. I'm not sure there would be any easy way for us to know in that perspective what the incremental number would be. And anyway, the one we're interested in is what percentage of revenue in the bus industry is now made up of sales of electric buses as opposed to fossil buses. So it's a different question than the one the individual transit agency faces, which is, as I said, I think best focused on the incremental life cycle cost.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Lynn, Ralph is, did you have a follow-up? While Ralph is responding to Lynn Oliphant, I'd invite Hector Garcia to turn on his video and sound, and that will be the last question in this formal session. So Lynn, it's over to you.
Lynn has departed. I'm asking that you read her question.
Okay. Did I cut you off, Raymond? No? All right.
Sorry, yeah, a bit. So so I guess the question was more to the overall investment that's happening out there. So when we're talking about $100 billion a year in Canada, I think some of that is incremental investment above and beyond what is already planned, right? Because if you look at the energy industry in Canada, there is all sorts of refits of nuclear plants, for example, and other things that are being spent on that represent a very large portion of our GDP already. And I'm concerned sometimes that we're overcounting stuff, and it makes the situation look a lot more dire than it is from a financial perspective, right? So I don't know if Ralph, if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I'm with you on this, Raymond. I think that certainly in the big scenario work we did at Corporate Knights, we did focus on the incremental capital investment required for the efficiency options, for example, and the renewable options as compared with conventional. So absolutely.
Okay. Thanks. I've got to run. Thanks.
Page.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Raymond. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. I found it extremely exciting, music to my ears to hear you talk about a paradigm shift and the need for us to find a way to address the communication crisis that we're experiencing, because as you pointed out, without the paradigm shift, we cannot see the solutions. So we're trying to continuously and persistently, at great cost of time and money and other investments, to find solutions when we don't see the questions that need to be asked, nor the many people who are providing us with part of the answers, but are not being heard. So could you expand on both communications and paradigm shift?
Well, it's a great question and comment to end on, I think, because it brings us full circle to the transition context that I started out with this afternoon. This is a big shift. It's right there with the Copernican revolution and other major shifts that have occurred in the human understanding of our place in the scheme of things. And it's going to take time. On the other hand, if I go back far enough, I was a student of physics, and I also studied a little bit of philosophy of science, and was very influenced, as I'm sure many of you were, by Thomas Kuhn's book on the structure of scientific revolutions. And I think he may have been the one who actually popularized the use of the word paradigm when he talked about how things can actually change very quickly once a compelling reframing of a problem is put forward that makes it simpler. And we see this same principle over and over again. Peter Drucker wrote about it in the business sense. Eisenhower wrote about it in the military strategy sense. When you're faced with a problem that seems too big and too complex to solve, very often what you need to do is change the way you look at it. Maybe expand the boundaries around it. Maybe in physics, we would say, that looks pretty difficult in Cartesian coordinates. Let's try polar coordinates. And suddenly, maybe it becomes much easier to see what the solution looks like. In crystallography, you can look at the image of a crystal and it will look hopelessly complex. You rotate it by 20 degrees and suddenly you realize you're looking at a beautifully symmetrical lattice. And of course, the granddaddy of all of these examples is probably the crisis that physics itself faced in the late 1800s, where increasingly the understanding that we had of the way the world worked and the equations that we were using to describe light and so on were not able to explain some of the things that we were empirically seeing in the evidence. And so a number of brilliant physicists, including Einstein and others, rewrote the framework and made things fall back into place. And we see this over and over again in the human story, where just before things get much clearer, they look impossible. And I think maybe we're at that point at the top of that transition mountain that I put the slide up of to start with, where we've been pushing this impossibly heavy rock uphill, feeling like it's just eventually going to start rolling backwards and crush us. But once we get to the top and see the landscape from up there and see a new way of looking at it that places the human story into an ecological context in a way that we have not done in the past, then all sorts of things will start to happen very quickly at that point. And I think we're on the beginning of that transition now. I hope we are. I've got grandchildren, and this has got to be the century where humans make that transition to seeing themselves in the broader ecological context of the planet that limits everything that we do, and acting and governing themselves accordingly.
Thank you, Ralph. That's beautiful to hear. I hope you join us on March 23rd. I'm going to be talking about that paradigm shift.
Thank you, Lynn. The last speaker while we're recording is Hector Garcia, and I'd like to welcome him as the most recently joined member of KCOR. Hector.
Hector has already answered. Thank you.
Sorry,
I think we're coming to the end now.
Yes. So in that case, let me go over to Jean, please.
Thank you very much, John. And Ralph, thank you for, it's my pleasure to thank you on behalf of KCOR for an absolutely wonderful presentation. I think it's great that you were be able to give us some positive comments to make, and that there might be a light at the end of the tunnel. I just hope it's not a train coming, but that's what I'd like to say. And you've done it. It was an excellent presentation and excellent chat for the people that came. So thank you so much for what you did today. And for those of you who are still with the call, I would strongly encourage you to go to the canadiancore.com, which is our website. There you can look at the Stay Informed section if you want to get the most recent links to new information that's been going on to our website. You also would be able to see this particular talk as well as all the other talks that we have had in our series, Zoom presentations. You can look at those on the video link on our website, and you can search those links as well. And in addition to that, if you want to find more information about becoming a member of KCOR, all of that is on our website as well. So please look at the website, and I look forward to seeing you at the next presentation. Thank you.